Today I'm going to give you a run-through of how I became a book conservator and the road I took between graduating Wellesley and ending up where I am today. I'll talk about my time here at Wellesley, specifically in the Book Arts Lab and the conservation departments. And I'll also cover my experiences there and talk about the things that I found really helpful to my career, as well as things I wish I'd done better, or I wish I'd taken better advantage of or had done differently. I'll follow that by discussing my life after graduation from Wellesley, my application to grad school, and the pre-program internships that I did. And then next I'll talk about attending Westdean College in the UK, which was my conservation graduate program. And I'll tell you about my experiences there. Finally, I'll wrap it up by discussing the jobs that I've had since graduating with an MA in book conservation. And then after that, I'll open up the floor to any questions. I was first introduced to the Book Arts Lab through winter session workshops that were being offered there, and I'm sure you'll all recognize this wonderful space. I've always been a creative person, and I loved knowing how to put things together and how to make something new. I've also had a lifelong love of books and reading, so when I was able to combine these two things together, that was absolutely perfect for me. When I found out that Wellesley was offering 2-day workshops in bookbinding, letterpress printing, and marbling, I immediately signed up for all of them. In the end, I think I spent about half of my first January at Wellesley in the Book Arts Lab. It was great. I was hooked from day one, and when the final workshop ended, I just didn't want to stop. When a job for student employee came up in the Book Arts Lab at the end of my first year, I applied for it enthusiastically. At the time, there was only one student position there, and because it's such a wonderful job and Catherine is amazing to work for, you can imagine that once hired, a student stays there for pretty much the entire time that they're at Wellesley. I've sometimes wondered how different my life would be right now if I hadn't been hired back in my first year, or if the timing of the open position hadn't worked out, or if I'd never even noticed the initial workshop postings back in November of 2005. I feel so lucky that things were turned out the way that they did. My work-study job in the Book Arts Lab was truly life-changing. I learned so much while working there, and I loved that I was learning historic skills. It felt incredible to be able to put in hard work and then create something tangible at the end of each day, as well as carry on traditions like typesetting, bookbinding, and letterpress printing. I was also lucky enough to take a class in 2008 with Catherine Ruffin and Ruth Rogers called Papyrus to Print to Pixel, which Catherine briefly described. This covered the history of written communication, and I'm not sure the laser pointer works too well, but I can just highlight some of the moments from the class there. We were able to make actual sheets of papyrus using papyrus from the Wellesley College greenhouses, which was such an experience. I had no idea I could even do such a thing. We learned how to cast type. We did some stone cutting, which you can see right here. It's really good. You can't actually see how crooked that line was because turns out I'm no good at that.
I have the evidence upstairs.
Oh no. I thought that was lost to history. There was typesetting. We actually did some casting of type, which was very interesting. And then also letterpress printing in traditional presses, some medieval bookbinding. And it was really just the perfect combination of theory, history, studying original books, and objects for special collections, and hands-on experience making the things that we were learning about. At the end of my first year of working for Catherine, I was looking for a summer job, and she mentioned that Emily Bell in the conservation department next door was hiring. I really enjoyed being able to repair books and make them usable again, and once I learned that I could someday do the same for rare books and manuscripts, I knew that that was what I wanted to pursue as a career. And that's actually, it's really interesting because today I was making a book that I was casing in, and I was doing it in a certain way, and one of my colleagues said, "You started in a library bindery, didn't you?" And still today I use the techniques that I learned then, so it's just a funny little moment. And often when you're applying for conservation programs, having prior experience is mandatory, and it's incredibly hard to get this experience pre-program. And even when graduate schools don't require this pre-program experience, it's generally a good idea, and it allows you to hit the ground running once you start the program. Working in the conservation department at Wellesley not only allowed me to get the experience that I needed, but helped me to determine that this is something that I really loved doing. It's rare for colleges to offer opportunities like this to students. More and more, it's outsourced to commercial binderies, and I am forever grateful that I had this opportunity. It's also important to note that experience builds upon experience. My job in the conservation department here at Wellesley was considered a major bonus when I was searching for pre-program internships. I'm not sure if I would have even been invited for an interview at some of these internships if I didn't already have the conservation and book arts lab jobs on my resume. There is so much that I gained from my time at Wellesley. As I mentioned before, my work-study jobs here were a major highlight for me. I took full advantage of many resources, like the Book Arts Lab workshops, 4-credit book-related classes, and also asked for plenty of career advice from Catherine and Emily. It's impossible to do everything in just 4 short years, so there are also a few things that I wish I'd done more of. I wish I'd spent more time in special collections. I was often there for class and occasionally did research there, but I wish I'd done even more research there for my Medieval Renaissance Studies coursework. It's an incredible resource as a world-class collection, and there's nothing like being able to study the source material in person. I also did one independent study during my senior year with Professor Wall Randall. I focused on a particular binding that Queen Elizabeth I herself did when she was only 11, which you can see right here. And she actually translated a manuscript from French into English and then did the embroidery herself for her stepmother, Catherine Parr.
And she was 11?
She was 11. Yeah, I look at this and I'm like, how? You know, and her handwriting, if you see the handwriting inside, it does look somewhat childish, but it's still, I would say, better than my handwriting at the age of 31, so that's something for me to consider. I was pretty interested in the subject, so it was really fun for me, but it was also a great way for me to get practice in self-directed learning, which is a very important skill for grad school. It made writing my MA thesis seem much more approachable, less daunting, and helped me break down the planning and writing into more manageable chunks. If I had to go back to college and do it all again, I'd definitely want to do at least 1 or 2 more independent studies, both for the sake of interest, but also for the study skills that I learned. And in that vein, I wish I'd done a thesis while I was at Wellesley. I declared my second major, Medieval Renaissance Studies, in November of my senior year after discovering that I'd accidentally taken enough classes to major in it. That happens. And by then it was far too late to undertake a thesis. I turned down the chance to do one in my first major, psychology, because by then I knew I wanted to be a book conservator, and I felt that my time would be better spent taking more relevant coursework for grad school. I don't regret finishing my original major, psychology. I found it very interesting, and the required statistics courses were invaluable when I was doing my very science-heavy MA thesis. However, I wish I declared my Med-Ren major much, much sooner and made it a priority in terms of selecting which classes to take. I look back on old course catalogs, and there were so many that I wish I'd just really focused in on that sooner and done a little bit more planning. And that's not to say that I regret taking a variety of courses. I think the distribution requirements actually made me a much better and more well-rounded MA student, and a more well-rounded person in general. And then finally, when looking back, I wish I'd taken more pictures of my work in the Conservation Department and Book Arts Lab, which was definitely something that was highlighted when I was putting together this presentation. When applying to grad schools and future jobs, a portfolio of your work is very important. And while I took many photos of my work in the Book Arts Lab, for some reason, I took nearly none of conservation work. A portfolio with a decent set of images can really make you stand out from other candidates and set you apart. I was able to get into grad school with the photos that I did have, but I learned my lesson and I now make it a #1 priority. And it is hard to remember when you're in the middle of a conservation treatment to stop and take a photo, so sometimes it's helpful if you've got friends nearby or colleagues to just shout out and say, hey, can you help me with this? Because, you know, sometimes you have glue in your hands and things are drying and it gets messy, but it's possible. Okay. I graduated at a very difficult time. This right here is when I graduated from Wellesley, and this is what the stock market did. And I would say that the first 18 months post-graduation from Wellesley were a particularly tough time for me, but also for a lot of other grads. And when I graduated in 2009, the recession was in full swing, so jobs were scarce, a lot of libraries had hiring freezes, and I was unemployed, you know, first for a few months, and then I was working 5 part-time jobs just to make ends meet. And it was, you know, it was a really scary time, and I also felt kind of embarrassed about it. You know, it made me feel like I wasn't living up to the Wellesley ideal. And what I wish I'd known then is that so many of my peers were in the same position as I was, and like me, they were also too embarrassed to talk about it. And I think it would have helped to know that other people were in the same place. And I also wish I'd known that I was eventually going to land on my feet. Graduating from college was the first time in my life when I didn't know roughly what I'd be doing in the next year, or where I'd be, or any of those unknowns. You know, and from kindergarten to college, you pretty much know you're going to be a student, you're going to be approximately doing student-y stuff in the next year. So it was really weird to suddenly have all of these unknowns looming large. And everything, you know, everything worked out in the end, and ultimately those 18 months of uncertainty ended up being very good for my career, and also my development as a person, which perhaps wouldn't have happened if I'd been able to go straight from college to a full-time job. You know, I was able to do internships, which I wouldn't necessarily have been able to do in a 9-to-5 job. And it also meant when I finally landed a job, I was so enthusiastic and such a hard worker because I didn't really take it for granted at all. And so, yeah, as I mentioned previously, I spent the first 18 months of college sort of working a bunch of part-time jobs and applying to pretty much everything under the sun. And I took pretty much every opportunity that came my way. So this, you know, this did provide a certain degree of flexibility and did allow me to take on internships and also sort of work placements, 2 of which were at the Boston Athenaeum. You can see their conservation lab right here. And the other one was at the Harvard Business School's Baker Library. Both internships were not official positions that I could apply for. I was offered them after having informational interviews, and these interviews came from networking. At the Athenaeum, a family friend took a tour of their conservation department, and knowing that I was interested in going into the field, persuaded the head of the department to give her his contact information so that I could write to him. And knowing this particular family friend, she's very persuasive and persistent, so I'm 100% not surprised. My family's laughing because they know who this is. And years later, after the head of the department, you know, I was talking to him and catching up with him, and he admitted to me that before I'd emailed him, he had absolutely no intention of offering me an internship position. He said, however, that I'd written him one of the most clear, detailed, and compelling cover letters he'd ever seen, and he was curious to meet with the person behind it. And after a phone interview and an on-site interview, I was, much to my delight, offered an internship. And I suppose that's the point of networking. It doesn't give you an easy ride or a free ride to a job, but it does allow you to get your foot in the door and give you a chance to make a good impression. So at the Athenaeum, I did what might be considered fairly simple conservation tasks. I might not even call them treatments, but these were an excellent foundation for my future conservation career. I spent the first few days there learning how to sharpen and adapt tools like microspatulas and bone folders to make them more suited to my needs. And I also spent a fair amount of time encapsulating a large collection of oversized Civil War broadsides, some of which were nearly as tall as I was, which is not very tall. I have no idea how many I had to do. I probably lost track around the 200th one. And I suppose I could have felt frustrated that I was only able to do very simple tasks that were incredibly repetitive, but I honestly wasn't. I was truly thrilled to be there, and I felt lucky that I'd been given this opportunity. Those basic tasks were also a great experience. Caring for one's tools is an integral part of being a good conservator, and my dad can really attest to this. He does work on forte pianos and harpsichords, and in his training program, you weren't actually allowed to progress beyond the first week of the program unless you learned how to properly sharpen your tools. And I can't think of a single conservation job I've had where I haven't had to encapsulate items. It happens. It's not glamorous, but it happens. There's also a certain element of trust in hiring a pre-program intern. Special collections materials are irreplaceable, and my supervisor at the Athenaeum had to get an idea of my skill level before entrusting me with precious items there. I knew that I'd reached that level of trust towards the end of the internship when he handed me a stack of books to surface clean. I opened the first one, and I nearly fell over in surprise. I turned to my supervisor and said, "It's signed by George Washington." He smiled, he shrugged, and said, "So are the rest of them." The Wellesley Network was also incredibly helpful in my job search. Ruth Rogers in Special Collections helped connect me to people she knew at Harvard Business School. And I was able to arrange a tour of the conservation lab there with Priscilla Anderson, who was head of the lab at the time. There weren't any open positions when I did the tour, but I suppose I must have made a good impression, because several months later, Priscilla emailed me out of the blue, after having seen her in the line at Trader Joe's, and offered me short-term conservation work for an upcoming exhibition, which you can see over here. While there, I did fairly simple treatments, basic paper mending, tape removal, and exhibitions prep, but there was also a fair degree of mentoring and education. Priscilla taught me about color matching and toning repair tissues, which I actually use on a pretty regular basis today. And she also taught me how to use solvent set repair tissues, which they're kind of invisible here, but I actually use to repair some of the leaves in this book. The solvent set tissues are used sometimes around iron gall ink because aqueous treatments, with wheat starch paste can be very damaging and spread some of the corrosive metal ions in the paper. And it turns out she's very modest about it, but she's actually a definitive resource on the subject. And in my first year of grad school, I was incredibly surprised to open up some of the required course readings on solvent set repair tissues to discover that she'd authored the article in the book. Sorry. There we go. There is Westdean College in all of its glory. I applied for grad school a few months after graduating from Wellesley. I already knew that I wanted to study book conservation in England and that I needed an MA in order to progress in the field. This narrowed it down to two choices for me, Westdean, which you can see here, and Camberwell. After visiting both programs, I fell in love with Westdean, obviously. As you can see, the college looks like a castle, and having been raised on a steady diet of Harry Potter books, I was very excited about heading to the book conservation equivalent of Hogwarts. More importantly, Westdean had more resources for students, more instruction, and more time spent at the bench than other programs I'd looked at. I was admitted after undergoing a full-day interview at Westdean, which included a practical skills test, a portfolio review, and multiple interviews with various faculty members. After my acceptance, I ended up deferring my start date for 1 year because, like many students, I was very stressed about having enough money to pay for the program, and I wanted some extra time to save up for it. This ended up being a really great decision for me. I was able to get more conservation experience before starting the program, and I could hit the ground running once I got there. It meant I already had a base layer of knowledge once I got to Westdean, which helped me to take my studies further and just delve a little bit more deeply into things. Being at Westdean was wonderful. After years of planning and hard work, I was finally able to study book conservation full-time. And you can see part of the workshop up there. There's sort of multiple rooms. It's kind of like a little bit of a warren. You know, I got to work on, for instance, these signal books. These are from the Admiralty Library in Portsmouth. And these signal books, there would be one per ship, and they had all of the flag signals. And there could only be one per ship because if it was captured, they would know that it was captured so they could change all their flag signals so that enemies couldn't read the secret messages that they were sending between ships. I was able to study Islamic bookbinding with a specialist tutor who came in. You can actually see a close-up of that right there. And we also took a number of visits to various libraries and sort of museum institutions throughout England. Right here you can see this is a medieval chained library. It's sometimes called the Heretics Library because there are so many works by heretics in there, and for whatever reason they weren't burned. Nobody knows quite why. Most of the chains, the original medieval chains are replaced by the Victorians. Don't ask me about the Victorians, I don't like them. So they swapped them from sort of cast iron links, and there were a few still remaining, to shiny new brass ones, which don't have quite the same effect, but all of the original books still remain there. And the great thing about Westdean is that it's a really immersive program. I spent about 50 to 60 weeks in class or doing conservation treatments or on coursework. And towards the end of the term, that number was closer to 80 or 90 hours per week. And I really love that there's so many other conservation disciplines being studied in the same place. They had books, they had ceramics, they had metals, they had furniture, they also had a musical instrument making program. And there was a lot of opportunity for cross-training between the departments. And there were also, Westdean takes its students on a study tour every year. So my first year we all got to go to Italy and look at some conservation labs and museums and libraries there. And in our second year we went to the Netherlands, and we even got to see a paper making mill which operates only by wind power. It's in an actual windmill. So yeah, it's a really, really great place. It is a small program, which can be great for individualized learning. There's approximately 5 students per year of the program, and about 40 to 45 students who live on campus full-time. And fortunately, everyone gets along pretty well. I think you have to learn to get along really well in that environment. It was kind of a culture shock coming from the city and moving into the rural countryside and going there. It drove me up the wall for the first 3 weeks, honestly, but after that I loved it. And I made some really close friends there, and I got to spend a lot of time just fully immersed in that learning environment. So yeah, it was really great. And during the spring of the first year, you'll notice that this is not books. I was able to do an internship at the Leather Conservation Center in Northampton, UK. And they brought me in originally to do some conservation on what's known as stationary bindings or springback bindings. These were account ledger books that were historically used. It's going to look a bit violent, but they pop open like this. They spring out of the spine, and they lie perfectly flat, so you can write even into the margins and the joints of the pages and record the most amount of information possible. So I was doing that, and then once I'd finished that up, they allowed me to do some leather conservation. So I worked on this leather satchel, which was actually used by a soldier in World War II. And then they also do quite a lot of automobiles at the Leather Conservation Center. So I worked on the leather seats of this 1901 Moores automobile, which actually does, it's still in operation, and it does the London to Brighton race every year still.
Cool.
And I really love this internship because they actually, you know, they put a lot into me. Like, I gave them some of my time, but they also spent a lot of their time teaching me. You know, they taught me how to do some leather conservation techniques, as I said. They taught me how to do leather identification. One of the book conservators there taught me how to do gold tooling, so it was a really useful, it felt like it was a really mutual benefit type of thing. And an integral part of the Westdean program is an on-site work placement for 6 weeks in your second year. And I was lucky enough to go to Cambridge University Library, where I had the chance to complete a Gothic Mudahar binding, which is a 14th century binding style which features Islamic design elements, and it originates in Spain. And they also actually let me work on some of the collection materials there. So I was able to work on a collection of 1,000-year-old Hebrew manuscript fragments from Cairo, and also this 15th century manuscript leaf, among other things. And then at the end of your Westdean career, the last few months are really devoted to writing an MA thesis. I'd sort of stumbled upon my topic, which was researching the long-term aging properties of 3 commonly used conservation adhesives. And I stumbled upon it because I was doing some research into actually a little bit of textile conservation, and I realized that one of the common adhesives between textile conservation and book conservation, there were a lot of people using it, but it was actually very under-researched. There wasn't a lot of quantitative data about its long-term aging properties. And I thought this was really surprising, since so much of conservation is making sure that the materials we use are safe to use on the objects and will be safe, for many, many years to come. So yeah, I undertook this huge, perhaps overly large and overly intense project, researching these 3 adhesives. I did aging studies. I tested how they interacted with leather and paper and all sorts of things. And what I discovered at the end of it is that one of them was effectively fine. It's not reversible, which is not so good for the field. But long term, it wasn't off-gassing any dangerous compounds. It didn't cause any sort of discoloration, that sort of thing. But 2 of the adhesives had significant problems. And if you can see up right here, I've got 3 metal samples. That's lead, copper, silver. And you put them in these little closed containers right here with a little bit of humidity and the adhesive sample. And then you subject them to a moderate heat for about 30 days. This is called the Audi test. And you can see this doesn't mean anything. The copper's discolored, but that did that for the control samples as well, so that's meaningless. But this lead sample right here is actually corroded. It's actually formed a little bit of a stalactite right here. And that indicated to me that the adhesive was off-gassing acetic acid, which is very harmful to organic compounds. And you can also see one of the adhesives right over here. When it was subjected to high heat, it also discolored significantly. And then one of the other adhesives, it also was off-gassing sulfur compounds, which again is very harmful to organic materials. So yeah, that's basically, that was the topic of my MA research. I presented it at a few conferences. It kind of made a few waves because a lot of people do use these. And I also found out that the adhesive, this one right here that I had tested, the British Library had also tested how long it off-gasses for, and it was found to do so for as much as 5 years.
Wow.
So it's not like you can just let it sit for a little while. And also in the process of my research, I discovered that in addition to book and textile conservators, natural history conservators use one of these adhesives for taxidermy because they use it to re-adhere little bits of hair to the animals and even parts of butterfly wings.
Huh.
Okay, you might recognize some of these people. This was a very surreal experience for me. And it actually came out of kind of a stressful experience for me. I spent pretty much every single term at Westdean worried that I wouldn't have enough money to pay for the next term. And so I also spent a lot of time constantly applying for scholarships and also drawing from the savings that I had built up before attending. And so I was actually able to graduate without taking on any additional loans, which was fantastic. And although it was stressful to constantly worry about money, getting those scholarships opened up doors to experiences like this. Because one of my funding sources for my MA came from the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Trust, which is also known as Quest. And towards the end of my second year at Westdean, Quest approached me and asked if I would be willing to exhibit some of my bookbinding work, which you can see right over here, at the Coronation Festival held in Buckingham Palace. I'm not sure if anyone says no to that, but and I was also invited to the Royal Preview Day, and so I got to watch the Queen of England, Prince Charles, and the Duchess of Wales, examining my bookbinding work and, you know, looking through it. I even got to shake Camilla's hand. As one of my friends said, of all the royals, that one? She was very nice. And it's a day I'll never forget, and you know, I think it was one of those life lessons that even when you have to work a little bit for something, or, you know, great things can come out of it. And after graduation from Westdean, I immediately started a job at Cambridge University Library, working on a collection of medieval paper and parchment manuscript fragments in Hebrew and Arabic from the Cairo Geniza. So in the Jewish faith, religious documents are set aside in a storeroom known as Geniza as they become worn. And you can see this storeroom right here. It's only accessible by ladder, and they're just throwing things up and over the top. And so after a few years, which traditionally it's about 7, the documents are buried in a ritual ceremony as a mark of respect, much as you bury a loved one, for instance. And the Bene Ezra synagogue in Cairo, their Geniza was added to continuously for nearly a millennia, and it was not emptied for more than 800 years, which is a long time. And you can see some of the fragments are actually starting to poke up and over the top, because that storeroom goes all the way to the bottom as well and very far back. And this collection of fragments, it offered an unprecedented look into Jewish medieval daily life. So it featured shopping lists, which looked surprisingly similar to something I'd get from the supermarket. You know, chicken, some chard, good olive oil, that sort of thing. There was a letter from the woman escaping the Crusaders, which you can see right here, and that was just, you know, really heartfelt, and I'm stepping on something. Felt like it, you know, it was just full of emotion. It was also really amazing because, you know, it's nearly 1,000 years old and it was written by a woman, which for me was just really exciting to see. There were magical spells. This one right here is a magical spell. It's a love spell. Gets a little weird. There's this Jewish divorce decree. That's the first known example of that. And there's also writings in Moses Maimonides' own hand, which is right over here. And the Geniza was actually largely unknown to people until about the late 19th century, when 2 intrepid world-traveling twin sisters, Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson, you can see one of them right here on a camel, they discovered some of these fragments for sale in the bazaars in Cairo on their travels. And the sisters, they took the collection of fragments, about 1,800 of them, back to Cambridge, England with them, and they invited their friend, Solomon Schechter, who was a well-known rabbinical scholar in Cambridge, to view a particularly noteworthy item in their house. And upon visiting them, he spotted another, even more notable fragment on their table, which was actually the lost Hebrew original of the Book of Ben Sira, which is also known as Ecclesiasticus. Schechter set off to Cairo quickly, which in those days was about a year. And he was very determined to find the source of these fragments because he suspected that there was something much, much larger at play here. And so he eventually discovered the Cairo Geniza. And after meeting with and befriending the caretaker there of the synagogue, the caretaker said, well, you know, whatever these fragments you like, you can take. And as he famously said, I liked them all. And so he actually ended up with 200,000 fragments, which are now all in the Cambridge University Library, and it's the world's largest unified collection of Geniza fragments. I think the next largest collection is at Oxford, and that's, by comparison, 25,000. This act actually saved the fragments from being divided up piecemeal and sold to private collectors so that researchers can actually still access these fragments today. And just here, this is an example of a letter he wrote to the sisters. He's very excited. He has all sorts of crossings out, and he's just saying, you know, I'm going to come to you tomorrow morning and talk about this. Don't tell anyone. And he actually ended up he sent the letter, and then he just went over to their house anyway because he was just so excited about it. You can see him here working on some of the fragments. And then this is kind of the state that the original fragments were often in. You know, they were very dirty, they were crumpled, they'd gone through a lot of damage. So alongside a team of 2 other conservators, I was responsible for treating the Lewis Gibson Sisters collection, which was acquired jointly by Cambridge and Oxford in 2013. Their fragments were relatively stable, all things considered, and their time in the Geniza meant that they were largely untouched for nearly a millennia. You know, there were characteristic damage such as insect damage, moisture, not too much mold, a lot of dirt, that sort of thing. But actually the biggest problem for these fragments is that the sisters, with the best of the best of intentions, had actually taken these to a commercial bindery in the 1900s and had bound them into large volumes. And so you'd gotten things where there were repairs like this, which just covered the entire surface of the fragments. There were all sorts of hinges that were causing damage and kind of breaking points. And so what I was responsible for doing was reversing a lot of the treatments, doing some small repairs as necessary so that these items could be digitized. And you can see a before and after of a fragment right there. So I really loved working for Cambridge. The collections there are unparalleled, and the people in my department were fantastic. But I was primarily working on flat paper and parchment, which is not what I was trained to do. So in short, I was turning into a paper conservator, and that wasn't really what I wanted in terms of my career. And the unfortunate thing about hand skills is that if you don't use them, you do lose them. And so I was forgetting a lot of the book-specific treatments that I'd learned, and I knew that unless I'd switch jobs soon, then I might not ever be able to work on books again, and that was really sort of frustrating and scary for me. So after spending 3 years working at Cambridge, I moved back to the US to begin as a book conservator at NEDCC, or the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is just over in Andover. NEDCC is a nonprofit organization that does conservation of books, paper, photographs. They do digitization. There's an audio preservation department, and also a department that is general preservation assessments. There are about 16 conservators working here, which is just fantastic. That's a whole lot. If you've ever visited other conservation facilities, it's usually in the order of 2 or 3 at most. And they're often much smaller or have a narrower focus in terms of specialties. I didn't really realize it before applying to the job there, but NEDCC is the best possible place I could be at in terms of my, at this stage in my career. So I started there as a fairly new conservator. I was only about 3 years past my training program. And what I really like about NEDCC is that people come from a range of training backgrounds. So US programs like Buffalo, UK programs like Westdean and Camberwell, bench training, meaning they train sort of as an apprenticeship. There's the North Bennett Street School, which does bookbinding. And actually our senior book conservator got to start doing bookbinding in the Boy Scouts. And I think if I'd known that, I maybe would have tried to join the Boy Scouts. Okay. So I really like the diverse array of backgrounds and experience, as I mentioned, which means everyone has a different perspective and approach to conservation, which is great for learning. You know, everyone, regardless of their experience level, asks your advice. It actually helps me think critically when someone who's more senior than me wants my opinion on something, and it helps me sort of develop my own opinions and also structure my learning a bit better. It feels like being in school again, actually, in a really good way, minus the homework. And the work I'm given here is really diverse. So I've worked on copy press books, which you can see right here. It's an early form of, not photocopying, but basically of copying documents. This is actually P.T. Barnum's, and that's a receipt he wrote out in his own hand to General Tom Thumb. There's also, this was a Polish soldier's diary, and he'd done these really sweet little poems and illustrations. This was a 15th century Mamluk Quran over there. Up there, there was a medieval manuscript, and also Civil War diaries, town records, that sort of thing. And it's really fantastic for just getting a wider range of experience and gaining new skills and techniques. And it also means I have to be really flexible in my work. So on the same day that I was working on that medieval manuscript right there, I was also working on concert programs from the 1980s. So it's just very different, night and day. And another aspect of my job right now is that I provide treatment proposals for our clients and do on-site collection level assessments for libraries throughout New England. And learning to do treatments on books, it's an important part of conservation, but it's also, learning to assess and provide treatment plans, which helps me think critically about why I'm doing those treatments in the first place. And also, what might best suit the object, and also its intended use by the client. This particular library, it's mostly as a room in a historic house, so some of the books are for show. They actually bought the collection in the 1950s by the yard, and you can see that some of these books really were by the yard, so they've just chopped off the spines, and it's just looks. I should emphasize the institution didn't do this. This is the way that they bought them. But yeah, it really is books for show. So just trying to help the books, be around for a longer period of time, while also understanding that this collection almost never gets used. And as I mentioned before in my job prior to starting NEDCC, I felt like my book conservation skills are being lost due to disuse. And when I interviewed at NEDCC, I was very honest and upfront about that. I said, I really want to do this job because it'll get me back into book conservation. I see it as a great learning opportunity and that sort of thing. But still starting at the job made me realize just how much I'd lost in terms of those book conservation skills, and that was a pretty big knock to my confidence. It's hard to admit that I needed to ask for help in learning certain basic tasks, and I felt kind of embarrassed about it. I'm a perfectionist at heart. I think a lot of people at Wellesley are. Yep. And so it was, it was really hard to ask for help, and yeah, it was a struggle. But I learned, what I came to find out is that the more that I asked for help, the more I learned, and also the easier it became to ask for help. And now I'm not even embarrassed about asking for something. I ask for help before I need it rather than after I've gone, oh no, I don't know how to do this. And that's actually, honestly, the best career lesson I've ever learned, is learning to admit my own sort of, I guess, weaknesses, but, gaps in knowledge, and move to remedy those, and also just learn to not be too proud to admit that I just need some help. So, I'd like to wrap up by telling you that it's really easy to look back and feel like my career was this one smooth, continuous path from Wellesley to where I am today. But along the way, it often felt like anything but that. There were weeks, months, and even years where I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. Often when people talk about their careers, they mention the highlights, and it looks like everything follows one linear path from point A to point B. In reality, there are always sort of detours and diversions along the way. So a bad economy, needing to accept a job because you need to pay rent, all the sorts of practical things. And actually looking back, it's been the times where things have seemed the hardest that I've actually learned the most. It wasn't easy dealing with uncertainty for those first 18 months after graduation, nor was it easy feeling like I knew almost nothing when I started at NEDCC. But those are the times where I grew most, both personally and professionally. Being a book conservator is a unique and rarefied field. It will never be financially rewarding, but I wake up excited every single day that I get to go to work. And that's something I value in a job above all else. And also, the thrill of opening a book and discovering that George Washington has signed it is no less than it was 10 years ago. I feel really proud that I'm helping to keep part of history around for future generations, and to me, that's what keeps me going every day and makes me just so excited to do what I do. I'd just like to end by acknowledging the people who have mentored and helped me launch my career in conservation: Catherine, Emily, Sarah Wall-Randall, and Ruth Rogers here at Wellesley. And as also my colleagues at the Northeast Document Conservation Center who have listened to various versions of this and also provided me with photos and helped me out along the way. So thank you very much for coming. Yeah, and I'd like to open up the floor for any questions if people have any. Yep. Go ahead.
So I'm a junior right now. When I graduate, I'm thinking pretty seriously about going to grad school in the UK, and I was wondering if you could give any thoughts on how it's different, like the pros and cons of studying there as opposed to on this side of the pond.
It's cheaper to study there. That's a major pro.
I like that pro.
It's also, I'm not sure what exactly you're considering in studying, whether it's conservation or something else. Classics. That's a great place to study classics because they, obviously the UK has been around for a lot longer in terms of books and manuscripts and that sort of thing. They have just fantastic collections. We do here as well, but there's so much history over there. Their young is considered 500 years old. Here that's, 50 years old. I had one of my cousins visiting from the UK last week, and she went to a 400-year-old house and just kind of was like, yep, yeah, whatever. My house is older. Oh, that piece of furniture, I have one of those. I have 3 of those, that sort of thing. So it's really great for that. And it's really great studying just in a different country. You meet all sorts of different and interesting people. It's, it's good to be in a different place and study in a culture different from your own. So yeah, I recommend it. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the jobs that you had in that early phase that were not part of what might look like a linear path toward where you are now? The kinds of things that you did where you may not have known where it would lead, or you knew that it would lead anywhere, but you just needed the job.
Yeah. So that first year out of Wellesley, I was working. I was doing reception for a local museum. I was working as a nanny, 2 different nannying jobs. What else did I do? It's, that time sort of blurred together. There was some customer service that I had to do, that sort of thing. And I think it was mostly stressful just because I didn't sort of know where the next job would come from or how long a job would last, or just, the uncertainty of having to piece things together. And I also did a short-term contract in bibliographic services at Harvard Law Library, which, I very much discovered that I don't have the kind of brain that is necessary to do that. But I also made some lifelong friends and had a really great experience there. So all sorts of things. Oh.
I have one follow-up if I might. I often find myself talking with students about exactly this situation, and people are often quite afraid of what's going to happen. It's a month or 2 away from graduation, similar to where we are now, and some people haven't found anything. I wonder, what would you say to people in that situation to assuage their fears? Is there something that you can say?
It's going to be okay, and it's also okay to move in with your parents. Thanks, Mom and Dad.
What was the thing about paying rent?
That wasn't really brought up as outside of the question. But there are things you can do, and the first year or 2, or even a few years outside of Wellesley, it might not look ideal, but it's okay, and you have your entire life ahead of you. And no experience is ever wasted.
Is there a reason why you didn't apply for grad school before you graduated Wellesley? Or because you said you didn't apply until after you graduated and then you still waited a year before going. So I was just curious about why that was the case.
Yeah, that was a conscious decision on my part because I didn't want to go straight from college to grad school. I'd spent the previous, 13 years straight in school from the time I was in kindergarten to the time I was in college, and I just felt like I was ready for a break, and I felt like, I don't know if I described it as burnt out, but I just thought I'd be a much better student if I took some time, and also if I, grew up a little bit. And what I noticed when I was attending my program, I attended once I was 2 years out of college, is that a lot of people who went straight from college to grad school, I won't say they lacked motivation, you know, but the people who were really driven were the people who'd waited a couple years, who'd really decided that consciously as a career choice, instead of being like, I don't know what to do, so I guess I'll just do this.
Yeah. Do you think that also helped to have the like the internships that you had previously before to have that experience?
That was really helpful. You know, it helped me get jobs after graduation because, you know, the people who didn't have experience prior to going to Westeen, they didn't really have any way to distinguish themselves after they'd gone to grad school, whereas the people who'd had the experience beforehand already had a proven track record. And also it helped me get a lot of scholarships. You know, I'd really demonstrated that I was interested in this career and had really committed to it, and that was really helpful. And with the scholarships, they kind of tended to build on each other, so once I got one, it was easier to get more and more and more.
Okay.
So, yeah. Yep.
Can you tell us how you help someone win a MacArthur Fellowship?
Oh, yeah. So this is when I was working on the Cairo Geniza fragments. I was contacted by a scholar through the Geniza Research Unit, and they said, can you please unravel this tiny little corner of a fragment? Basically, the collection had been digitized, and there was this little corner that was bent over, and they said, you know, we really need to see what's under there because we think this could actually change the meaning of the text. And so I spent half a day carefully unfurling this really old, scrappy little piece of parchment, and it revealed one letter, and that one letter, it changed the entire meaning of the word, and by extension, the interpretation of the text. And, you know, I sent this picture off to the scholar, and they said, thank you so much. This is just life-changing. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Who was this scholar?
I can't remember the name.
Oh, you.
I can look it up later if you're interested, though.
I am.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So they'd written back to me, and, you know, they said, thank you, this is life-changing. I was like, scholarly exaggeration, whatever. And then 6 months later, I saw that they'd actually won a MacArthur Fellowship specifically for their research into the Cairo Geniza, so they were serious. Yep.
I'm thinking about potentially applying to conservation programs.
Cool.
And I was curious about the science requirements, and
Mm-hmm.
both when you're applying and also the class you take when you're in grad school, and how you adapted to that coming out of Wellesley, especially being a non-chem major.
So I sort of, it does vary from program to program. Some programs really require it. I think there are some that require 3 semesters of chemistry. Westeen doesn't actually require it at all. They said, you know, we'll teach you what you need to know. You know, just come here with the knowledge you have. I did take a chemistry course in my senior year of Wellesley because I felt like I needed that extra little bit of knowledge. But yeah, in the end, you know, it would have been fine if I'd gone to Westeen without that chemistry background, but it did make it a lot easier. So yeah, some programs actually require you to know quite a lot. In my career, I found it to be really helpful. And I've actually made it a point to study sort of on my own, just to keep up that basic knowledge of chemistry, and specifically how it relates to paper and leather, because it has been really useful. I do come from a somewhat non-sciencey background, but I've always loved math and science, so that does help. There are some people who are less into that side of things, and they also manage to do well in conservation, so it's totally manageable. Yep.
Can you share with us a bit if you have thoughts about how you might think about the next steps in your career, or if you have sort of ideas about ways that you could continue to learn and grow in this area?
Yeah, so one way I sort of keep current in my career is I do try and present at conferences and try and do research on my own. Right now at NEDCC, it's, you know, because so much of our time is spent doing specifically client material, we don't have our own collection that we can draw on. There's less time for research than I would like, so it's really something I have to do in my own time. And then also, I just received my professional associate status from the American Institute for Conservation. And to do that, it's done by a peer review panel. I had to submit all sorts of documentation and projects that I'd done and essays and that sort of thing, and get recommendations. That was another way that I sort of was able to reflect upon my career and kind of move it to the next level. At NEDCC, I'm an assistant book conservator right now. We have 3 levels, so the next step up would be associate book conservator. That's something I want to work towards in the next 2 or so years. So I've got a list of requirements for that, and I'm trying to check things off on my list.
So students, I hope you write down this email address here and follow up with Mary.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, so yeah.
And you've been so honest and generous with us this afternoon. Thank you so much.